Hello and welcome to the Chatterbox Letters podcast. I am going to be reading a very large chatter-like letter to my listeners. This book, aka Chatter Letter, is called Holes. I hope you will enjoy as I read Holes in audio format. I will be reading chapter by chapter so it seems interesting as you are curious to know the whole story at its entirety. Introducing Holes by Louis Sachar. I will be reading chapter 7. All right, let me go ahead and locate chapter 7. All right. Okay, I think I almost have it. All right, I have chapter 7. The shovel felt heavy in Stanley's soft, fleshy hands. He tried to jam it into the earth, but the blade banged against the ground and bounced off without making a dent. The vibrations came and ran up the shaft of the shovel and into Stanley's wrist, making the bones rattle. It was still dark. The only light came from the moon and the stars, more stars than Stanley had ever seen before. It seemed he had only just gotten to sleep when Mr. Podensky came in and woke everyone up. Using all his might, he brought the shovel back down onto the dry lake bed. The force stung his hands, but made no impression on the earth. He wondered if he had a detective or defective shovel. He glanced at Zero. About 15 feet away, he scooped out of the shovelful of dirt and dumped it in a pile that was already almost a foot tall. For breakfast, they had been served some kind of lukewarm cereal. The best part was the orange juice. They each got a pint carton. The cereal actually didn't taste too bad, but it had smelt like his cot. Then they filled their canteens, got their shovels, and were marched out across the lake. Each group was assigned a different area. The shovels were kept in a shed near the shower. They all looked the same to Stanley, although X-Ray had his own special shovel, which no one else was allowed to use. X-Ray claimed it was shorter than the others, but it was. It was only by a fraction of an inch. The shovels were 5 feet long from the tip of the steel blade to the end of the wood shaft. Stanley hole would have to be as deep as his shovel, and he'd have to be able to lay the shovel flat across the bottom of any direction. That was why X-Ray wanted the shortest shovel. The lake was so full of holes and mounds, it reminded Stanley of the pictures he had seen of the moon. If you find anything interesting or usual, Mr. Podensky had told him, you should report it either to me or Mr. Sir when we come around with a water truck. If the warden likes what you found, you will get the rest of the day off. What are we supposed to be looking for? Stanley asked him. You're not looking for anything. You're digging to build character. If you just find anything, the warden would like to know about it. He glanced helplessly at his shovel. It wasn't detective. He was the detective. Okay, next page. He noticed a thin crack in the ground. He placed the point of his shovel on top of it, then jumped on the back of the blade with both feet. The shovel sank a few inches into the packed earth. He smiled. For once in his life, it paid to be overnight or overweight. Excuse me, I'm messing up with my words. He leaned on the shaft and pried up his first shovelful of dirt, then dumped it off in the side. Only 10 million more to go, he thought, then placed the shovel back in the crack and jumped on it again. He unearthed several shovelfuls of dirt in this manner before it occurred to him that he was dumping his dirt within the perimeter of his hole. He laid his shovel flat on the ground and marked where the edges of his hole would be. 5 foot was awfully wide. He moved the dirt he'd already dug up to pass his mark. He took a drink from his canteen. 5 foot would be awfully deep, too. The digging got easier after a while. The ground was hardest at its surface, where the sun had baked a crust about 8 inches deep. Beneath that, the earth was looser. But by the time Stanley broke past the crust, a blister had formed in the middle of his right thumb, and it hurt to hold the shovel. Stanley's great-great-grandfather was named Elia Yelnats. He was born in Latvia. When he was 15 years old, he fell in love with Myra Menke. He didn't know he was Stanley's great-great-grandfather. Myra Menke was 14. She would turn 15 in 2 months, at which time her father had decided she'd be married. Elia went to her father to ask for her hand, but it was so Igor Barkov, the pig farmer. Igor was 57 years old. He had a red nose and fat, puffy cheeks. I will trade you my fattest pig for your daughter, Igor offered. And what have you got? Myra's father asked Elia. A heart full of love, said Elia. I'd rather have a fat pig, said Myra's father. Desperate, Elia went to see Madeline Zermoni, an old Egyptian woman who lived on the edge of the town. He had become friends with her, though she was quite a bit older than him. She was even older than Igor Barkov. The other boys of the village liked the mud wrestle. Elia preferred visiting Madame Zeroni and listening to her stories. Madame Zeroni had dark skin and was very wide-mouthed. When she looked at you, her eyes seemed to expand, and you felt like she was looking right through yours. Elia, what's wrong? She asked. Before he even told her he was upset, she was sitting in a homemade wheelchair. She had no She had no left foot. Her leg stopped at her ankle. I'm in love with Myra Menke, Elia confessed. But Igor Barkov has offered to trade his fattest pig for her. I can't compete with that. Good, said Madame Zeroni. You're too young to get married. You got your whole life ahead of you. But I love Myra. Myra's head is empty as a flower pot, but she's beautiful. So is a flower pot. Can she push a plow? Can she milk a, next page, goat? No, she is too delicate. Can she have an intelligent conversation? No, she is silly and foolish. Will she take care of you when you are sick? No, she is spoiled and will only want you to take care of her. So she is beautiful. So what, Pruitt? Madame Zeroni spat on the dirt. She told Elra that he should go to America, like my son. That's where your future lies, not with Myra Menke. But Elia would, would hear none of that. He was 15 and all he could see is Myra's shadow beauty. Madame Zeroni hated to see Elra so forlorn. Against her better judgment, she agreed to help him. It just so happens my soul gave birth to a litter of piglets yesterday. She said that is one run womb she won't suckle. You may have him. He would die anyway. Madame Zeroni led Elra around back of her house where she kept her pigs. Elra took the tiny piglet. He didn't see what good in it would do him. It wasn't much bigger than a rat. He'll grow, Madame Zeroni assured him. Do you see the mountain on the edge of the forest? Yes, said Elra. On the top of the mountain there is a stream where the water runs uphill. You must carry the piglet every day to the top of the mountain and let it drink from the stream. As it drinks, you are to sing to him. She taught Elra a special song to sing to the pig. On the day of Myra's 15th birthday, you should carry the pig up the mountain for the last time. Then take it directly to Myra's father. It'll be fatter than any of Igor's pigs. If it that big and fat, asked Elra, how would I be able to carry it up the mountain? The piglet is not too heavy for you now, is it? Asked Madame Zeroni. Of course not, said Elra. Do you think it would be too heavy for you tomorrow? No. Every day you would carry the pig up the mountain. It would get bigger, but you will get a little stronger. After you give the pig to Myra's father, I want you to do one more thing for me. Anything, said Elra. I want you to carry me up the mountain. I want to drink from the stream, and I want you to sing a song to me. Era promised he would. Madame Zeroni warned that if he failed to do this, he and his descendants would be doomed for all eternity. At the time, Era thought nothing, of course. He was just 15-year-old kid, and eternity didn't seem much longer than a week from Tuesday. Besides, he liked Madame Zeroni and would be glad to carry her up the mountain. He would have done it right then and there, but it wasn't yet strong enough. Stanley was still digging. His hole was about 3 feet deep, but only in the center. It sloped upwards to the edges. The sun had only just come up over the horizon, but he already could feel its hot rays against his face. All right, next page. As he reached down to pick up his canteen, he felt a sudden rush of dizziness and put his hands on his knees to steady himself. For a moment he was afraid he would throw up, but the moment passed. He drank the last drop of water from his canteen. He had blisters on every one of his fingers and one in the center of each palm. Everyone else's hole was a lot deeper than his. He couldn't already see their holes, but could tell by the size of the dirt piles. He saw a cloud of dust moving across the wasteland and noticed the other boys had stopped digging and watching it too. The dirt cloud moved closer, and he could see it trail behind a red pickup. The truck stopped near where they were digging, and the boys lined up behind it, X-ray in front, Zero in the rear. Stanley got in line behind Zero. Mr. Sir filled each of their canteens from the truck or the tank of water in the bed of the truck. As he took Stanley's canteen from him, he said, "This isn't the Girl Scouts, is it?" Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. Mr. Sir followed Stanley back to his hole to see how he was doing. "You better get with it," he said, "or else you're going to be digging in the hottest part of the day." He popped some sunflower seeds in his mouth, definitely removed the shells with his teeth, and spat them into Stanley's hole. Every day Elra carried the little piglet up the mountain and sang to it as it drank from the stream. As the pig grew fatter, Elra grew stronger. One day of Myra's 15th birthday, Elra's pig weighed over 50 stones. Madame Zeroni had told him to carry the pig up the mountain on that day as well, but Elra didn't want to prevent himself to Myra smelling like a pig. Instead, he took a bath. It was his second bath in less than a week. That he led the pig to Myra. Igor Bakar was there with his pig as well. "There are two of the finest pigs I've ever seen," Myra's father declared. He was also impressed with Elia, who seemed to have grown bigger and stronger in the last 2 months. I used to think you were a good-for-nothing book reader, he said, but I see now you could be an excellent mud wrestler. May I marry your daughter? Elia boldly asked. First, I must weigh the pigs. I must weigh the pigs, excuse me. Atlas, poor Elra, should have carried his pig up the mountain one last time. The pigs weighed exactly the same. Stanley's blisters had ripped open and new blisters formed. He kept changing his grip of the shovel, tried to avoid the pain. Finally, he removed his cap and held it between the shaft of his shovel and his raw hands. This helped, but digging was harder because the cap would slip and slide. The sun beat down on his unprotected head and neck. Though he tried to convince himself otherwise, he'd been aware for a while that his pile of dirt was too close to his hole. The piles were outside his 5-foot circle, but he could see he was going to run out of room. Still, he pretended next page, otherwise, and kept adding more dirt to his piles that he would eventually have moved. The problem was that when the dirt was in the ground, it was compacted, expanded when it was evacuated. The piles were a lot bigger than his hole was deep. It was either now or later. Reluctantly, he climbed up out of his hole and once again dug his shovel into the previous dug dirt. Myra's father got down on his hands and knees and closely examined each pig, tail and snout. Those are two of the finest pigs I ever seen, he said at last. How am I to decide? I have only one daughter. Why not let Myra decide? Suggested Elia. The prosperous, exclaimed Igor, expelling saliva as he spoke. Myra is just an empty-headed girl, said her father. How can she possibly decide when I, her father, can't? She knows how she feels in her heart, said Elmer. Myra's father rubbed his chin. Then he laughed and said, Why not? He slapped Elia on the back. It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig. He summoned his daughter. Elia, excuse me. Elia blushed when Myra entered the room. Good afternoon, Myra, he said. She looked at him. You're Elia, right? She asked. Myra, said her father. Elia and Igor have each offered a pig for your hand in marriage. It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig. So I will let you make that choice. Whom do you wish to marry? Myra looked confused. You want me to decide? That's right, my blossom, said her father. Gee, I don't know, said Myra. Which pig weighs more? They both weigh the same, said her father. Golly, said Myra, I guess I choose Elia. No, Igor, no, Elia. No, Igor. Oh, I know. I'll think of a number between 1 and 10. I'll marry whoever guesses the closest number. Okay, I'm ready. 10, guessed Igor. Era said nothing. Era said, Myra. My number, what number do you guess? Elia didn't pick a number. Marry Igor, he muttered. You can keep my pig as a wedding present. Next time the water truck came, it was driven by Mr. Pedansky, who also brought stacked lunches. Stanley sat with his back against a pile of dirt and ate. He had a bologna sandwich, potato chips, and a large chocolate chip cookie. How you doing? Asked Magnet. Not real good, said Stanley. Well, the first hole hardest, Magnet said. Stanley took a long, deep breath. He couldn't afford to dawdle. He was way behind the others, and the sun just kept getting hotter. It wasn't even noon yet, but he didn't know if he had enough strength to stand up. He thought about quitting. He wondered what would they do to him. What could they do to him? His clothes were soaked. His clothes were soaked with sweat. Excuse me again. In school, he had learned that sweating was good for you. It was nature's way of keeping you cool. So why was he so hot? All right, next page. Using his shovel for support, he managed to get his feet. Where are we supposed to go to the bathroom or when? He asked Magnet. Magnet gestured with his arms to the great expanse around them. Pick a hole, any hole, he said. Stanley staggered across the lake, almost falling over a dirt pile. Behind him, he heard Magnet say, but first make sure make sure nothing's living in it. Excuse me again. After leaving Myra's house, Elia wandered aimlessly through the town until he found himself by a wharf. He sat on the edge of a pier and stared down into a cold black water. He could not understand how Myra had trouble deciding between him and Igor. He thought she loved him. Even if she didn't love him, couldn't she see what a foul person Igor was? It was like Madame Zeroni had said. Her head was as empty as a flower pot. Some men were gathering on another dock, and he went to see what was going on. A sign read, Deck hands wanted. Free passage to America. He had no sailing experience, but the ship captain signed him aboard. The captain could see that Era was a man of great strength. Not everybody could carry a full-grown pig up the side of the mountain. It wasn't until the ship had cleared the harbor and was heading out across the Atlantic that He suddenly remembered his promise to carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain. He felt terrible. He wasn't afraid, of course. He thought that was a lot of nonsense. He felt bad because he knew Madame Zeroni had wanted to drink from the stream before she died. Zero was the smallest kid in Group D, but he was the first one to finish digging. "You're finished?" Stanley asked eventually. Zero said nothing. Stanley walked to Zero's hole and watched him measure it with his shovel. The top of his hole was a perfect circle, and the sides were smooth and steep. Not one dirt clod more than necessary had been removed from the earth. Zero pulled himself up to the surface. He didn't even smile. He looked down at his perfect dug hole, spat in it, then turned his head back to the campground. "Zero one weird do," said Zigzag. Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zigzag had to be the weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had a long, skinny neck and a big round head with wild, frizzy blonde hair that stuck out in all directions. His head seemed to bob up and down on his neck like it was on a spring. Armpit was the second one to finish digging. He also spat in his hole before heading back to the camp compound. One by one, Stanley watched each of the boys spit into his hole and return to camp. Stanley kept digging. His hole was almost up to his shoulder. Next page. Although it was hard to tell exactly where ground level was, because his dirt piles completely surrounded the hole. The hole he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt up and out of the hole. Once again, he realized he was going to have to move the piles. His cap was stained with blood from his hands. He felt like he was digging his own grave. In America, Elia learned to speak English. He fell in love with a woman named Sarah Miller. She could push a plow, milk a goat, and most important, think for herself. She and Elia often stayed up half the night talking and laughing together. Their life was not easy. Elia worked hard, but luck seemed to follow him. Bad luck seemed to follow him everywhere. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He remembered Madame Zeroni telling him that she had a son in America. Elia was forever looking for him. He'd walk up to complete strangers and ask if they knew someone named Zeroni or had ever heard of anyone named Zeroni. No one did. Elia wasn't sure what he'd do if he ever found Madame Zeroni's son anyway. Carry him up the mountain and sing the pig lullaby to him. After his barn was struck by lightning for the third time in a row, he told Sarah about the broken promise to Madame Cerrone. I'm worse than a pig thief, he said. You should leave one and find someone who isn't cursed. I'm not leaving you, said Sarah. But I want you to do one thing for me. Anything, said Elia. Sarah smiled, singing me the pig lullaby. He sang it for her. His eyes sparkled. That was so pretty. What does it mean? Elia tried his best to translate it from Latvian into English, but it wasn't the same. It rhymes in Latvian. He told her, I could tell, said Sarah. A year later, the child was born. Sarah named him Stanley because she noticed that Stanley was Yelnats spelled backwards. Sarah changed the words of the pig lullaby so that they rhymed, and every night she sang it a little, or she sung it to little Stanley. If only, the woodpecker sighed. The bark on the tree was as soft as the sky. While the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, crying to the moon. If only, if only. Stanley's hole was as deep as his shovel, but quite not wide enough at the bottom. He grimaced as he sliced off a chunk of the dirt. He raised it up and flung it onto the pile. He laid his shovel back down on the bottom of his hole, and to his surprise, it fit. He rotated it and only had to chip off a few chunks of dirt here and there before it could lie flat across the hole in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching. He felt a strange sense of pride of being able to show Mr. Sir and Mr. Pedansky that he dug his first hole. Next page. He put his hands on the rim and tried to pull himself up. He couldn't do it. His hands were too weak to lift his heavy body. He used his legs to help, but he didn't have any strength. He was trapped in his hole. It was almost funny, but he wasn't in the mood to laugh. Stanley, he had heard Mr. Pedansky call. Using his shovel, he dug 2-foot holes in the whole wall. He climbed out to see Mr. Pedansky walking over to him. I was afraid you fainted, Mr. Pedansky said. You wouldn't have been the first. I'm finished, Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted hat on like his head. I'm finished, Stanley said, putting the blood-spotted hat back on his head. Had to read that part again. All right, said Mr. Pedansky, raising his hand for a high five, but Stanley ignored it. He didn't have the strength. Mr. Pedansky lowered the hand and looked down at Stanley's hole. Well done, he said. You want to ride back? Stanley shook his head. I'll walk. Mr. Podansky climbed back into the truck without feeling Stanley's canteen. Stanley waited for him to drive away, then took another look at his hole. He knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud nonetheless. He sucked up his last bit of slobber and spit. Oh, it's kind of yucky, with all the spitting in the holes and slobbering and all that. But that's part of the story of holes. And Stanley was the last one to dig his hole that he couldn't get out of. He had to build steps on the side walls to get out of his hole because he was so weak. But being the first and not the last one to dig a hole, it was his first hole he dug. And I guess he also spat in his hole too, or he didn't have enough spit to spit in that hole. But he sure wasn't given water. And that's what made me mad, because he wasn't given water, which in turn he had to swallow his slobber and spit. Ew, I'm getting disgusted even talking about it. But here it goes. I'm going to let everybody know that if you have a chatter letter that you want to have broadcast on my podcast, please send it to the Chatterbox Letters Podcast, Post Office Box 5556, Lakeland, Florida 33807. Everyone, please like, share, subscribe to my podcast. Hit that notification button to know once I go live. Ring that bell for updates on my podcast. And please, everyone, please, you guys, send me that first chatter letter to my post office box. I would really appreciate it very much. All right. Please do not hesitate to send me your chatter letter. Always procrastinate and send me your letter today.